sometimes in politics, people can say things which are foolish, or they can be assumed to be foolish. I think the current Lord Attorney General has been a silly Billy, but the moment I say that, I realise that nobody actually said that. No, Dennis Healey never said that. It was an invention. It was a creation by the impressionist Mike Yarwood, immensely popular entertainer and television personality in the 1970s and early 80s. He had this talent not only for mimicking voices, but for capturing and often inventing verbal tics or catchphrases that came to define a politician. And in the case of Dennis Healey, Yarwood created this silly Billy as a kind of mock scolding rejoinder, delivered in Healey's gravelly voice, paired with the raised eyebrows and the mock outrage. There's no record of Healey ever having said these words, but Yarwood's imitation was so widely seen. I think at the height of his fame, he was picking up 18 million viewers a night, and it embedded itself in the public imagination, so much so that even political journalists or cartoonists and commentators began to associate the phrase directly with Healey, despite its fictitious origins. A brilliant example of how satire and media can shape public perception more powerfully than reality. And once it stuck, it became part of the Healey myth, much to the Chancellor's own bemusement. And once he'd stopped being Chancellor, he became rather an endearing elder statesman. And to his credit, he was quite unfazed by the invention. He recognised the value and the absurdity of becoming a national character through someone else's impression. And in interviews, he would wryly acknowledge that Yarwood's version of him was better known than the real thing. This silly Billy thing would be a sort of hyper-reality when a fictional representation becomes more real than its origin. It's got echoes in modern satire with people like Sarah Palin, but Yarwood arguably was the first. He did it first. He did it best. He did it with Healey, with Harold Wilson, with Edward Heath, and in a way with Margaret Thatcher as well. Mike Yarwood gave Healey a catchphrase he never used, and it became the most memorable thing he said. But I think, and the only reason I go off on a tangent is because I think that Richard Hermer has been a silly Billy, and Richard Hermer is the Attorney General, and he's drawn a comparison between contemporary British calls to disregard international legal obligations made by Cummings, made by Badenoch, Jenrick, and Reform. And he's drawn a comparison between that and the jurisprudence of Nazi Germany. It's a provocative misstep, it's politically naive, strategically unwise, rhetorically self-sabotaging, and yet, despite the clumsiness, the comparison is not wholly without intellectual foundation or historical origins. There are uncomfortably parallels worth noting, not quite equivalences, not moral equations, but echoes that deserve reflection. And Hermer's speech was steeped in legal history, and his invocation of Carl Schmitt was more than rhetorical drama. It was a warning from jurisprudence. Schmitt, Hitler's crown jurist, argued that the sovereign should not be bound by law in times of exception, and he legitimized the idea that legality could be suspended by necessity, that the will of the state trumps law itself. And that's why Hermer drew this comparison. When modern politicians suggest the UK should pick and choose which international obligations to honour, especially in human rights and asylum, the ghost of Schmitt, the ghost of the Nazi architect, the architect of Nazi law, stirs in the background, and it's the reduction of law to an optional extra, which we've already seen from Suella Braverman and the Rwanda project. So from that point of view, Hermer is absolutely bang on the nail. So if you look at the parallels, not to equate, but to illuminate, The Reform UK and elements of the Conservative right have suggested withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights if it proves inconvenient. And that echoes Schmidt's doctrine of political expediency trumping legal constraint. And this rhetoric of sovereignty over supranational law dismisses the post-1945 framework designed precisely to prevent the abuse of unchecked national power. And that system, the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, the ECHR, was constructed on the ashes, or out of the ashes, of fascism. And to that I would also add the 1951 Refugee Convention. The erosion of judicial independence and the denigration of legal norms, calling judges enemies of the people, or woke judges, or whatever, lefty judges, threatening to ignore Strasbourg rulings, politicizing legality, completely overturning the decision of the Supreme Court, or the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court, in the case of Rwanda, making your own law because you don't like what the judges have said, all bear resemblance not to Auschwitz or Nuremberg, but to Weimar's slow institutional collapse and the Nazification of law. Yeah, these parallels of structure, they're not of substance. This context now is democratic. Theirs was degenerative. And so I think one needs to be emphatic. Nigel Farage is not Adolf Hitler. Kemi Badenoch is not a fascist. And suggesting so not only demeans political discourse, it disrespects the victims of actual totalitarian regimes. And today's legal debates are occurring within a functioning democracy, under the rule of law, in the middle of media scrutiny and electoral accountability. In 1933, Germany was already dismantling these safeguards. So the parallel falters on intention, extent, and ideology. Farage wants fewer migrants and not a Führerprinzip. And Badenoch wants sovereignty, not a Gestapo. Still, care needs to be taken. Democratic backsliding rarely arrives wearing jackboots, and I think it's worth looking at the way that Nazi Germany crumbled into tyranny. Hermer, in reaching for an historical analogy, tripped over the wire of Godwin's law. Once you invoke the Nazis, you're likely to have lost the argument. But sometimes the context of the rise of Nazi Germany is important. And his language was not only clumsy, it was damaging to the very cause that he tried to protect. By painting legal critics with the brush of fascism, he hardened their defences and handed them the moral high ground. It allowed Farage and Badenoch to put on the garb of offended patriots and defenders of sovereignty, a narrative that they wear with relish. Worse, it muddies a necessary debate about the role of international law in a democratic age. Reform is possible, indeed necessary, but it must be achieved without burning bridges or invoking bunkers. And Hermer's central concern is valid. When politicians begin to treat legal obligations as optional, the seeds of lawlessness are sown. But to defend the legal order effectively, one must be judicious not only in legal analysis, but in political language. And that's why I think Suella Braverman was so monstrous in her contempt for the 1951 Refugee Convention. If we think there's something wrong with such an international convention, then we should be holding an international assembly to redefine it. And in fact, I think it's absolutely essential. The 1951 Refugee Convention is no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century. It no longer addresses the same issues that were present in 1945. So it's right to raise the alarm when international law is dismissed as an encumbrance. It's wrong to compare one's domestic opponents to fascist jurists unless they actually are. And history teaches us to be vigilant but not hysterical. In short, we don't protect liberal democracy by crying wolf. We protect it by making better arguments, holding firm to principle, avoiding comparisons that collapse under scrutiny, however tempting they may be. So we need to remember the lessons of history, not weaponize them. And we need to debate the European conventions with seriousness, not sensationalism. and to defend the rule of law, not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion, where words matter most and where respect for words matters. And if we don't have respect for the words which are part of our law-making system, that is Parliament, then we lose respect across the country and internationally. That is where we are, by the way. The squabble with the Supreme Court has diminished the role of law. That is and we need to row back on that. That's why it's so important that any judgment which is made by the Supreme Court is now accepted by Parliament. But it's also important, I think, to look at these bigger conventions, these bigger international agreements, and see whether or not they need to be updated, revised, embellished, pruned.